Welcome and thank you for joining us in today's Wickery learning session, Developing Meaningful Research Partnerships with Indigenous. I would like to let all attendees know this event is being recorded, and I am a community-based research assistant located in Muskogee. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, language, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. We would like to thank Wickery's funders, the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, and the Alberta Women's Health Foundation for making today's session possible. It is now my great honor to introduce our two guest speakers presenting today. Melissa Tremblay is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology. For more than 10 years, Melissa has worked in the area of community-based participatory research with a particular focus on partnering with Indigenous communities. Richard Oster is a research associate in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Nutritional Science. Richard uses mixed methods and community-based participatory research approaches to work in equitable collaboration with Indigenous communities. Melissa and Richard, I pass the mic over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Luana. So I think if you want to stop sharing your screen, I can share mine here. Okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Luana, for leading us into our presentation. So my name is Melissa Tremblay, and as Luana mentioned, I'm here to talk to you today with Richard Oster about developing meaningful research partnerships with Indigenous communities. And so we're going to unpack what that means by taking you on each of our distinct but related journeys that we've experienced as researchers. And before we start, I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional territory that I'm coming to you from. So I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the lands of First Nations and Métis peoples. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you with a lot of sadness in my heart today in reflecting on the mass graves that have been found at the sites of former residential schools. And for me, I continue to reflect and think about how this has to mean more than reflection. It has to mean that we bolster commitments to advocacy for changing the ways that these tragedies continue to be reenacted in really systemic ways today. And part of that is ensuring that the research we do is serving Indigenous peoples in powerful ways. And so I hope that our presentation today is able to shed some light in this area. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Richard to take us through an outline and some of our learning objectives for our time together today.
Thanks, Melissa. So hi, everyone. Good afternoon here from Edmonton, where I am, Treaty 6 territory. It's definitely a pleasure to be here today and to see all the people in attendance, see you. I apologize for the awful lighting here in my office. I normally would have like the window blinds drawn instead of using like the overhead light, but it's just so hot that I want to try and avoid getting any heat into my house. And like Melissa, I don't think I can't start without acknowledging the confirmations of what has happened in several First Nations communities over the last little while, and I think likely will continue to happen over the summer. I heard one elder say that these aren't discoveries, they're confirmations. Like this is something that I've certainly heard in communities through talking to elders for many years, that they knew that these graves were present. This is just a confirmation of what they've known. So I know many people are carrying extremely heavy hearts during this time. I'm not sure I can bring much comfort, but I hope that much healing will ensue as a result of this coming to light more all across Canada. So on behalf of myself and Melissa, welcome to our session on developing meaningful relationships and partnerships with Indigenous communities. I'd like to thank WICRI for providing us the opportunity to have this hopefully really rich and thought-provoking discussion with you today. And here's just a little outline of what we thought we'd go through. So we'll begin with some introductions, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, where Melissa and I can tell you a bit more about who we are, where we come from, a bit about the work that we do, I think, and how we position ourselves as researchers in this area. Then the bulk of the talk will be answering some commonly asked questions. So we thought we would switch things up a little bit in terms of how we normally present and not talk specifically about some of the research we're doing, but more about questions we commonly get from people when when they're inquiring about how we've built relationships or what those relationships look like. So we'll take turns answering these questions of how did you get started doing this, i.e. how did you get started developing meaningful relationships? What do those relationships look like? And how do you work in a relational way within academic systems? And after that, we will try and bring everything together with some final thoughts, and then we'll have tons of time for questions and discussion. Speaking for myself, I can't speak for very long, so I'm sure we'll have at least 30 minutes for questions and discussion. All right, next slide. So I think by now it's no secret that research with Indigenous communities requires meaningful, accountable, equitable partnerships. And through this presentation, we're going to discuss the use of a relationship-based approach to research and partnership building, focusing on co-creation and the adaptation of research methods to local circumstances. So these are our specific learning objectives that we hope to achieve today. So learn how meaningful research partnerships can be fostered between researchers and Indigenous communities. And then secondly, to understand the conditions required for community-based participatory research in partnership with Indigenous communities. So some of you may have heard me speak on this topic before, and I apologize if I put you to sleep, but I think we've structured the session a bit differently than either of us have in the past to try and get more at those realities of community-based participatory research. So hopefully some similarities and differences between Melissa and I will emerge because this is not always straightforward. I think that's something we'd like to get across to everyone. There's definitely a spectrum of engagement and relationship building, and each project and community will be unique and different. There's definitely some core tenets that are foundational, such as reciprocity, and strengths-based, solution-oriented research, and relationship development. But again, I hope you'll see some of the nuances develop as we go through the talk.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So just by way of introductions, I'll start by introducing myself. And I always like to introduce myself by introducing my family because that really speaks to who I am. So I love this picture of my parents because it's so fantastically dated. And you know from looking at it around what year it was taken. So this is a picture of my parents on their wedding day holding my oldest brother. They were only 14 and 19 years old when they had my brother and got married. So that blows my mind a little bit. But my dad is Cree from the Lac-Saint-Anne area here in Alberta. And my mom is French, also from Alberta. So I'm Métis, which is recognized as one of the Indigenous groups in Canada. I'm also a mom. So this is a picture of my two boys. They're 4 and 2 years old. And I'm also expecting a third baby right now. So that baby will make an appearance in September, hopefully. So busy household I have. And to situate myself professionally, I started out really looking at Indigenous research while I was completing my master's degree in partnership with Bantaro Traditional Healing Society. So my master's research looked at the social emotional competencies that are beneficial for Indigenous children who are navigating multiple cultural worlds. And that was my first glimpse into community-based research and my first real taste of research that was done outside of a lab. After that, I was fortunate enough to work as a research coordinator under Dr. Lola Baydala, who's a pediatrician at the U of A, on a substance abuse and violence prevention program, the Maskwacis Life Skills Training Program, or MLST program, in partnership with Maskwacis community members, Maskwacis being a First Nations community about an hour south of Edmonton, where Richard and I have both done quite a bit of work. So I worked on that project for about 5 years, and that was where I developed my first real understanding of the spectrum of participatory research and how research could be relational. So from that project grew a number of spin-off projects, like a photo voice project, where we raised awareness about the community's strengths in the face of a lot of negative media attention and public attention that the community gets. And then in the last couple of years, I found myself back in Maskwacis working on a couple of different projects, but most prominently the Early Years program, which I'll draw on examples from today. So the Early Years is a partnership between health and social service institutions in Maskwacis and the Martin Family Initiative, which is a foundation that's actually based in Montreal. So my role in that project is to lead the research and evaluation of the Early Years program. And that's in my capacity as a faculty member in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Alberta. So I'm also a registered psychologist. And I've been a faculty member in EdPsych for coming up on 3 years now. And it's also the department where I completed my doctoral work. So overall, I position myself as an Indigenous scholar. And I also acknowledge that I've been trained in methods and worldviews that are conventionally very colonial and problematic for a lot of Indigenous peoples on the whole. So I continue to grapple with that in my capacity as a researcher, an educator, and a clinician. So I would also situate myself primarily as a qualitative researcher, also a mixed methods researcher, having had early academic roots in more quantitative psychological research methods. So that's where I'm coming to you from today. And I'm going to pass it over to Richard to do an introduction as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. So for those of you that may have heard me speak before, you're likely getting used to seeing my kids. It's usually the first slide I put up. And lately I've been trying to update the pictures I use of them to something more recent. So this one was actually taken a couple of weeks ago, where I was lucky enough to take them up north a little bit to Cross Lake. We were doing some fishing and camping together there. You know, we all have our roles during our time here on planet Earth, and certainly they are my number one priority. So again, my name is Richard Oster. My Cree spirit name is Wapastem, which means white horse. I was born and raised here in Edmonton. My family roots date back to Europe, so I'm a bit of a mixed mutt of European descent, with a family coming from Austria, Germany, Denmark, Ukraine, Scotland. Those are the ones I'm aware of. And my family's been here for about 4 generations. And I live here and I work at the U of A as a research associate currently. And the work we do is very collaborative, very community-based, with a specific focus of partnering with Indigenous communities. I also work part-time for AHS as a senior scientist, again, doing very similar partnership-based Indigenous health research work. And I think collectively, we're trying to identify and highlight and build from community-derived ideas, mostly to support pregnant women and their partners and their families. So specifically, we aim to incorporate the strengths and the resilience embedded within Indigenous knowledge and wise practices and cultural teachings. and put those into appropriately designed and effectively evaluated strategies that actually benefit Indigenous communities and move in the direction of rebuilding family and community systems that have been systematically dismantled. So I consider myself a partner. That's the term I like to use. I'm not an expert in Indigenous health. I don't try to be one. I'm just someone that's lucky enough to be working with Indigenous communities and partners. And I try to be a student. I try to be a helper, and again, a partner working together towards common goals. Sometimes I guess I'm a bit of a disruptor of systems that don't work anymore necessarily. I think the key word about what I just said, though, is working with Indigenous communities, so not on or about. So that really gets to the heart of my work. I believe meaningful and effective transformative research can be achieved through partnerships and relationships. And that's certainly proven true, I think, over the years that I've been able to do this work. So working with Indigenous communities that prioritizes that collaboration piece and community engagement and trust building pieces of the work, and most importantly, the community-led piece. And in terms of positionality, I definitely like to position myself as a community-based participatory researcher. So someone that knows that effective research that improves the well-being of Indigenous peoples can't be designed by me, because Indigenous peoples are the knowledgeable experts in the issues that are affecting them. So working together throughout all aspects of the research is really important to me. We work to build something together, recognizing each other's unique experiences and individual skills. So community-based research is a core positionality for me. So is strengths-based research. Many of you have heard me talk about this before. So I think stories of deficit through research have been told enough, and that we need more responsive research, more solution-oriented research, focusing on the positive aspects of health and well-being and positive approaches and solutions to negative health issues. Focusing on empowering communities and decolonizing systems and reframing the issues such that they shame the influences of colonization and westernization rather than shaming Indigenous peoples, which has kind of been the pattern in deficit-focused research in the past. So that research merely shows how sick Indigenous peoples are without properly framing that can perpetuate deficit-focused narratives that can contribute to ongoing stigmatization and stereotyping. So that's another core tenet of how I position myself, is strengths-based research, and that includes mutual benefit and respect. So it's very much a two-way street. We work in the realm of developmental origins of health and disease. So thinking of a 7-generation way of thinking, and fostering healthy pregnancies is kind of our main goal, as a means of preventing chronic diseases way before they begin. So we know that our health trajectories begin within the womb, and if we can have healthier pregnancies and healthier families during that time, we can have healthier offspring and families well into the future. And lastly, I think one of the main pieces of how I position myself is Indigenous ways of knowing. So that means placing Indigenous voices and epistemologies at the center of what we're doing. And I think that really goes hand in hand with the relationship piece and the collaboration piece. So we can challenge the belief that Western methods are the only objective and true science. And really, we try to marry the two when appropriate. And following an Indigenous ways of knowing approach means practicing humility. So again, there's more than one truth out there, and really providing a platform for those other truths to be heard. So for Indigenous voices to be heard through our research. I could go on and on there, but I better stop. So, because I know we have a talk to get to, but that's a little bit about me.
Great, thank you. So as Richard mentioned, we wanted to frame our presentation today, not so much in the form of a lecture, giving you the idea that there's a recipe for success when it comes to meaningful partnerships, but to do something a bit different, we wanted to address some of those common questions that we get asked. And so one of those is, how do you get started on developing relationships? I get asked this question not only by students, but by students pretty regularly, and sometimes from students that I don't know. So I'll find, from time to time, find an email in my inbox from someone that says, hi, I'm a student in this certain faculty, and I want to do my research with Indigenous youth or Indigenous people. How do I get started? Sometimes students have an awareness that they need to do the work of relationship building first, and that they ask the question, how do I do that? What's my in? How do I form relationships in a way that comes across as genuine? And in order to do that, I think researchers have to have the humility and the self-awareness to recognize that research is actually a dirty word in some communities. And as Linda Tuhuai Smith, who's a New Zealand scholar, puts it in her seminal book on decolonizing methodologies, research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. So does this mean that all Indigenous communities have uniform negative experiences with research? No. It also doesn't mean that we can't form relationships, but it does mean that when we're forming those relationships and forging partnerships, that we can't ignore this reality. It means that our work is taking place against a backdrop of colonial policies and practices that make many Indigenous community members hesitant to trust academic researchers who come from outside of their communities, and justifiably so. It also means that when we're forming partnerships and relationships within those partnerships, that we need to be aware of the spectrum or the continuum of community engaged research. So we can't take for granted what's meant by community engaged research or community-based research or participatory research. We have to be honest and open about how investigator-driven our research is, or whether it is really the communities we're working with who are driving the research questions that we're exploring. As Richard already mentioned, there's a difference between research done in community versus research done with community. So getting started on developing relationships means having honest reflection and conversations about where on this spectrum we would position ourselves and our research, always keeping in mind guidelines like the Tri-Council policy statement that lay out some parameters and considerations to keep in mind. And although I said there's no recipe for success, there are a few key points that I like to keep in mind. So one of those is being present in the community without an agenda. And by community, I don't necessarily always mean geographical community. A community can be an agency or a group or a collective, but however you're defining community, being present to spend time with people who are members of that community is absolutely critical. So I want to be able to demonstrate in an authentic way that I care about the people who I'm forming a partnership with. And coming from a more experimentally trained research background, I want to acknowledge that this perspective was really foreign to me at first and kind of uncomfortable. Caring about the people that you're working with, aren't researchers supposed to be objective and distanced? And also to mention that being present without an agenda is difficult at times. As an academic, I have a lot going on, students to supervise, grants to apply for, committees to sit on, teaching to prioritize. So spending an entire day out in the community without kind of getting down to business and accomplishing specific research related goals can feel really strange at first. But it's also, from my perspective, what makes community engaged research worthwhile and reminds me of the human aspect of my work. Second, having openness to evolving goals. So we might start a project and have a number of research questions or objectives in mind. But then once we start working, we realize that there are additional or alternative community priorities that can be addressed through our work. And so we allow our research questions to evolve based on community feedback. And in my experience, funders are becoming more and more open and amenable to some of these kinds of changes. So just as an example, with my dissertation research, it was looking at a supportive housing program for teen parents. And we had the best of intentions to go in and measure child development outcomes at certain points during this intervention. And parents were just not open to having me wearing my psychologist hat, coming in and assessing their children, which makes a lot of sense given the anxiety that a lot of them have around someone coming in and taking their child away, apprehending their child to child and family services. And so what we found is that the parents we worked with were so much more open to engaging with us in arts-based methods and photo voice and methods where they had control over the research agenda. And they wanted to talk about some of the stereotypes they faced and discrimination as teen parents, which were not part of our research questions to begin with. But we went there because we were open to evolving goals and ended up having a really powerful process as a result. Third, I think it's important to rethink and interrogate certain buzzwords. So words like reconciliation, strength-based, community capacity building, all of these concepts I personally feel are really important to my work, but I have to be careful to define them when I'm using them. So thinking about, am I using these words with intention? Am I really aligning with a strength-based agenda? Or am I using these words without considering what it means to enact them in practice? And finally, this has been mentioned already, but embracing a learner mentality or a learner orientation. So I never personally position myself, just as Richard said, as an expert, but more of a learner. So I'm always willing to deeply listen when people in the communities that I'm working with are willing to teach me. I'm transparent about the fact that I don't have all the answers and that the communities I'm working with are actually where the knowledge and wisdom lies to address the health disparities that we're often seeking to address through our research. So I'm there to take a helper role or to work to provide my perspective on ways to access the strengths and solutions that already exist in communities by learning from the people who live there. So these are just some of the most important considerations that I like to keep in mind when I'm asked, how do I go about forming relationships? So I'm going to pass it over to Richard to talk a little bit more about this question.
Thank you, Melissa. That was beautifully said, brilliantly thought out. So what can I add to what Melissa said about how do we start doing this? How do we start developing meaningful relationships? This is the first picture I ever took when I was in Musquechies. I was at that time collecting data during my PhD. And I think I need to go back to that time a little bit to answer this question, to tell a little bit more about my story, because working in the realm of Indigenous health wasn't planned necessarily. It's definitely not something I was trained in, if you can even be trained in that way. It was very coincidental at first. And, like Melissa said, I was trained in a very different way, and I do consider myself a bit of a transformed researcher. My background training is in nutrition and food science and metabolism. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in that area, and spent a couple of years in a cell culture lab too. And that knowledge base is really important to me. I learned a lot for sure, and it was very biomedical, very bench science. I was truly fascinated learning about the human body, and I very serendipitously landed a research assistant job that was supposed to be a 6-month maternity leave position in Indigenous health and type 2 diabetes. That has just completely changed the course of my career. That was over a decade ago, and I did a lot of early work in big epidemiology related to type 2 diabetes in Indigenous communities, a lot of biostatistics, looking at rates and predictors and so forth, and didn't actually start going to communities for a couple of years after that. And that's where I feel like I've learned the most, is within communities, learning firsthand. And I've had like a number of really life-changing and perspective-changing experiential learnings. One of them being that when doing that type of epidemiology that is important, I was only getting truly just one side of the story and missing a huge piece of that community voice and what their experience is and what their stories are, and those stories behind the numbers, as we say. And so I jumped into qualitative research, and that was really hard to learn how to do at first, being trained in such a quantitative way. And now I'm doing fully fledged community-based participatory work that incorporates both qualitative and quantitative pieces. With that experience under my belt, like the first full CBPR project I embarked on was in 2013 with Musqueam. And really what I can say is, how do you start doing this? You just go. You go to the community, especially when you're invited. I spent at least a year and a half engaging the community first to develop those relationships and build the trust, develop a working group of sorts, and attended a lot of events within the community and volunteered gladly and happily to take part in that, and eventually got invited to ceremonies. And I think those were where my greatest learnings happened. So like Melissa had mentioned, research can be a really dirty word in Indigenous communities. And I didn't even mention that word for the first year and a half. I was just getting to know people and getting to know the community. And I'm not saying you have to spend a year and a half developing relationships. It will depend on the community that you're working with. But for me to work well with Musqueam, that's definitely what it took. And I'm grateful that I had the time to do that. So a couple of points I can try and pull out from my journey and my little story is, first and foremost, is to go to communities. So much of this, in my experience, is face-to-face meetings, face-to-face relationship building. Be open to going outside of work, be open to not having clear black and white lines of what is work and what is relationship building. I spend a lot of time in the community outside of business hours. The relationships I've developed there are like family and friendships, so I go there all the time. I think you can learn so much more in communities than you ever could from reading a textbook in your office. And those are experiences you need to have firsthand. From my experience, communities are very open and welcoming to you coming out there. So go to communities. It also you have to take the time. It can't be rushed. Like I said, it took me about a year and a half, and it's not something I checked off my list of things to do. And like now I've done engaging the community in relationship building. It's definitely an ongoing major piece of the work I do, is continuing to develop relationships and maintain relationships. So it's one thing to develop a relationship, but it takes a lot to maintain that relationship. I would also say, like Melissa did, listen, be humble, practice humility. You need to be open to learning. I think if you're going in figuring that you have the answers, then don't bother. Be willing to unlearn a lot of what you used to know and learn to think in a different way. I've had to do that. I've had to learn to listen to my heart, I think, a lot more, and think about my intentions of not going in to discover truths, but and working to advance knowledge, but going in to benefit communities. That's my goal. I really try and keep that front and center. It's really grounding for me to do that. Um, so be really clear about your intentions as well, and be sure that the community is wanting to partner on the project. So I felt like when I went to the community the first time, everyone was able to see me really easily. So be who you are. Like, I got asked that question a lot. I still do. How should I act, or how should I be when I go to the community? And you should be nothing but yourself, unapologetically. So yeah, I hope that added a little bit more to what Melissa already clearly identified. I think we can move on to the next question.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I think you really illustrated how we do have different kind of journeys and paths, but also a lot of similarities to reinforce. So thanks for that. So our next question we were going to address, we not only get asked how to go about forming relationships, but what do these relationships actually look like in practice? Well, there's no straightforward answer to that question, which, as you probably noticed by now, is kind of a theme developing through this presentation, that there's no straightforward answers. But again, there are some key points to consider. So first, I would say that these relationships involve learning to live with, and not just live with or tolerate, but taking that a step further and learning to honor complexity. So what do I mean by that? Well, primarily that the issues we're researching are almost always complex. In my work, for example, some of our broad research objectives recently have been focused on things like fostering cultural pride in Indigenous children, or scaling up interventions to reduce child welfare involvement, ensuring that parents have a strong understanding of their children's early developmental processes, or that Indigenous children are experiencing readiness for school on kindergarten entry and can reach the full potential that they're born with. So all incredibly complex issues that require cross-sectoral collaboration, multiple players in order to bring these goals to life. So in our relationships, I think we have to embrace these complexities, not try to stuff our research goals into boxes where we can neatly say, this intervention clearly caused this outcome, and we can leave it at that. But learning from our partners to understand maybe how certain interventions or processes are making contributions to change at the individual, family, and community levels, but accepting that there are no straight lines often that can be drawn between cause and effect in terms of our research goals. Also, the complexity that's inherent in the relationships themselves. So there's no rules for how to navigate the relationships that we form as part of community-based research. When a grant cycle ends and we no longer have the same day-to-day interactions that were facilitated by being part of a research project together, we have to navigate and figure out how to navigate those changes, how to stay in touch with people and honor long-term commitments in an ethical way. And that can mean thinking outside the boxes or the bounds of grant timelines. So for example, just because my 3-year grant is coming to a close doesn't mean I'm going to end my involvement with a community or the people in it. If we've started a program or intervention or some kind of initiative together that means something in the community, then I'm going to be intentional about working towards sustainability beyond the end of a grant term. Also, this idea of mutual capacity building is really prominent in the relationships that I form and maintain, which kind of comes back to this idea of positioning myself as a learner. So sometimes the people I work with are really keen on learning about research and evaluation methods from more of a Western academic perspective. And that's great. I'm always willing to help build capacity in that way. And sometimes the interest isn't there, and that's totally fair. But what I'm also always open to is building my own capacity to keep getting better at working with communities in a meaningful and ethical way, and to teach the students that I work with the same. And so this kind of mutual capacity building where partners are learning together and teaching one another can be a really impactful and important aspect of what these relationships look like. And it can also mean accepting points of stumbling, because again, I'm not going to have all the answers, but if I can have some humility and be willing to learn, and if I have those relationships in place, the mistakes I make and the stumbles I experience can be points of learning and building my capacity. So learning that it's okay to mess up sometimes can actually be really powerful. And finally, this idea of aiming for transformation. So what do I mean by transformation? I mean change that's palpable and noticeable. So I was listening to a talk a couple weeks back by Michael Quinn Patton, who's an evaluation guru, and he described transformative change as being change that shifts the way things are done in a way that's so noticeable that we don't need a significance test. We don't need a statistical test to tell us whether or not that change has occurred. So does this mean that every research project we do is going to result in transformative change? No, I don't think that's realistic, but it does mean that transformation is what we're ultimately aiming for. So in the early years project that I've mentioned, an unanticipated outcome has been huge increases in vaccination rates of the children in the program. So over the longer term, we anticipate transformative change to result from that kind of an emerging outcome. And eventually, we are aiming for all families in Maskwacis and vision down the road, all children in Canada to have access to the early years program. And for kindergarten teachers to be able to tell right away whether a child who's coming into their classroom was part of the early years program, has that foundation before they enter kindergarten. And so when we're aiming for that kind of visionary change, that facilitates relationships with the people to whom that change matters, and I think goes a long way in trust building. So I'm going to end my piece there and pass it over to you, Richard.
Right, thanks once again, Melissa. So I completely agree with everything Melissa said. There's definitely no prescription how to do this. And the relationships often include many different stakeholders at different levels. And I'll just talk a little bit more about the relationships with the people I work very closely with in communities. So I think how you conduct the research can be more or just as important as the research you conduct. And I've already said relationships are foundational to you a number of times. I truly believe that and try to live that in the day-to-day work that I do. So what does that look like? What does it mean? Well, it definitely means working together on all aspects of the research. So from the inception until well, there really is no end because it just continues to go into cycles and evolve into different research. And it should be, in my opinion, a lifelong partnership. So we do a lot of community consultation and engagement, but our principal means of working together is what we call community advisory committees. And, you know, these are people that I've been fortunate enough to develop really deep, intimate and personal and working relationships with. These are elders, community members, sometimes moms and dads, care providers that work within the community, and kind of other movers and shakers within the community. And that's where all of our decisions are made. And so, yeah, we often read about how important developing relationships is when working with Indigenous communities, but What does that actually look like? And, Melissa said it very well, that it will definitely depend on the community you work with, the project you're working on. But for me, it's looked like family, and not in the Western adoption way, but in a very, very real way. So I've been lucky enough to be adopted by two families within the community, and that's the level of trust I believe we have. So trusting those people with my kids, and trusting them with my secrets and with my skeletons in the closet. They've definitely seen me at my very worst and are still there, just like family should be. I definitely get teased by them like family all the time. And I already mentioned earlier, we spend a lot of time outside of work, especially pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, hanging out, eating together, doing things for one another, supporting one another, sitting in ceremony, and so forth. So our meetings are always very personal and intimate and supportive. So, maybe half of it sometimes is business and half of it is catching up with one another and talking about what's going on in the community and in each other's lives. Sometimes that's the entire meeting. And, I've just learned to embrace that. And like Melissa already talked at length about that. So why does it have to be so personal and intimate and supportive? Because I really truly believe we need to live each other's experience in order to better understand one another, to walk in each other's shoes. And it definitely doesn't fit within a 9-to-5 box, and it definitely takes a lot of time, as does every good relationship. As I mentioned earlier, it's not meant to be a one and done type of thing, but a lifelong partnership. That's the depth of relationship I need in order to work well with the partners I work with. And again, it will be different for every project. So it doesn't always mean everyone would have to partner in that way. And I know there's people that partner in even deeper ways than that. There's definitely a spectrum of community engagement, and it will depend on the individual community wants and needs and desires and capacity. It also unfortunately depends on, to some degree, on an ugly history of research that's unfolded in Indigenous communities, a history of mistrust and sometimes exploitation and even unethical research. And often well-intended research can have unintended consequences. So, the pattern in the past has been external observation of subjects with zero or little input from communities, and a sort of top-down authoritarian prescription of what communities should be doing. So a pattern of conducting research that tends to benefit the careers of the researchers and the science as a whole, but hasn't necessarily brought tangible benefit to communities that are struggling with significant disparities. And that history is not the distant past. In fact, it still happens. They call it helicopter research or mosquito research, I've heard. So coming in and sucking out some blood and then taking off. So I think acknowledging and knowing about that history really shows how important it is to develop these personal relationships and to build rapport within communities. So again, it doesn't have to necessarily mean a fully fledged CBPR project and spending years within the community, but you can do little things, take time to get to know the people you're working with on outside of a sort of business or research sense. Be clear about your research and your intent. I think developing trust in any little way you can will lead to richer data, especially if you're doing qualitative research and finding ways to build a bridge with your participant and be genuine and be vulnerable and be real with them. And these are things we're not taught in biomedical science. So again, getting back to that bit about unlearning what we've been taught. I think the last thing I'd say is that the relationships can look and can be uncomfortable at times. And I've just learned to be okay with that. They can be very muddled and complicated, just like family can be. So for example, one of the elders I work really closely with. I love her, and I know she loves me. And on one hand, I'm her boss in some sense, and on the other hand, she's my elder and my cookum. So that creates some complications at times, and we butt heads, and we laugh about it, but we just continue to try and learn from one another and live each other's experience and be honest. And like I said, be vulnerable. These are the same things I say to my kids about developing relationships. Relationships are a give and take, and you have to invest into them what you hope to get out of them. I think that's all I'll say. I'll leave it there and turn it over to you again, Melissa.
Okay, thank you. All really important points, and I love the examples. So finally, we wanted to address this question of how we work in a relational way within academic systems, because again, this can be complex. So first off, I think we have to be willing to challenge existing policies. When I worked on the Musqueam's Life Skills Training Program with Dr. Baydala and Dr. Faye Fletcher, their team was willing to do just that when elders were required to sign consent forms for their participation in research. And this signing of consent forms is problematic because when you give an elder an offering of tobacco, for example, and they agree to take part in whatever you're doing based on that offering, it can feel very inappropriate to then be asked to sign a consent form, because that essentially means we're not honoring cultural protocols around consent, but that our university consent forms trump those cultural protocols. So the research team was able to negotiate a consent process with our ethics board where oral elder consent was acceptable. And similar issues came up in asking for consent or assent from children. It didn't feel respectful. And providing your signature as a child on an assent form sometimes doesn't feel safe. So how do we push for processes of gathering child assent that involve processes where children are surrounded by community and family instead of signing an assent form? That's what I mean by challenging existing policies. And along these lines, being willing to negotiate new ways of working. So that might mean becoming a real pain to your finance department because they've never seen a researcher claim expenses for tobacco before, or make space in a budget for a moose hide because as part of your project, you're going to be facilitating a traditional moose hide tanning workshop. It might mean pushing back against policies that have us asking elders for their social insurance numbers when we provide them with an honorarium, which is super uncomfortable and still something we have to do. But there's currently a working group at the U of A that's working toward examining and shifting some of these policies and practices. It can also mean negotiating for communities to hold some of the funds that would normally only be directed to an academic institution. So for the early years project that I've been mentioning, I only hold a portion of the funds for research and evaluation at the U of A, and the community and the Martin Family Initiative hold the majority of funds in recognition of the need for self-determination and sustainability. Because I'm not necessarily creating something sustainable if I'm holding all the project funds at the university. And along these lines, ensuring that my research services office understands that in my funding agreement, I don't own the data from the projects that I do in partnership with community. And this sounds pretty simple, but in reality has been one of the most difficult concepts for me to navigate, to have written into my funding agreement that I won't publish or release any data without the consent of community partners is problematic from the university's perspective, because research services contract specialists typically want the researcher to be able to publish whenever they want. But that's just not how research works when we're working in true partnership. And so negotiating for different ways of working has been really important. And what helps with some of these issues is connecting with others doing similar work. So having colleagues who get it, other people who are doing community work and understand the time that's required to form those relationships, being willing to write into your annual report as an academic the time you spend on attending ceremony, building partnerships, for example, talking to your chair and your dean about these issues and the time spent so that they are aware and they also get it. And I can't say enough about how helpful it's been for me to collaborate with other researchers who have a passion for participatory work and accept constructive criticism, for me to accept that constructive criticism and think about what I'm doing from different kind of perspectives. And then finally, I have here remembering the why, because it can feel overwhelming to do research that takes a lot of time, a lot of presence, a lot of energy. So I'm constantly reminding myself of why I do this work in the first place. And that's because I want to do work that's human, that's aligned with my values, that I can be proud of, and that works toward those transformations that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. And so I'll just pass it over to you, Richard, to comment on this question as well.
Great, thanks. I won't talk for too long because I think you said it all. But just picking up where you left off, Melissa. One of the elders I've worked with for over a decade now. Her name is Margaret, and we call her our Mama Bear of our group. She's our leader for sure. She always says what we're doing is about life. And I try and hold that close to me all the time. So to try and remember why I'm doing this, as Melissa said, it's not to benefit me. It's to benefit the communities I work with and hopefully to make positive and meaningful and impacts on some people's lives within those communities. So I think if anyone remembers anything from what I said today, that would be it, is being really focused on what the intent of your work is. And for me, it's to benefit the community. So, is it difficult to work this way within academic systems? Sure, at times. It's you're going to have to pay out of pocket sometimes. Things won't always go as planned. It's very messy at times. You won't write as many high impact manuscripts. And personally, I don't put much weight into that at all, writing manuscripts. It's potentially to a fault to my career, who knows, but it just doesn't align well with the intent of my work. We do write manuscripts, but not as many as I used to when I would sit in my office with big data sets about Indigenous people and never set foot in their communities. So it will take more time than you think it will. I already mentioned unlearning. There's so much that I've had to unlearn. Like, there's no one objective truth. Biomedicine isn't better. PhDs don't always know best. It's not a linear process doing this type of work. I won't work in an individualistic way in my profession. Those things are all highly inaccurate and don't fit well with this type of work. So I would also say, how do you work in this way within academic systems? You just do it. Follow the lead of the community that you're working with. The systems that we have in place don't always reflect the needs and realities and worldviews of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. So you have to be willing to disrupt those systems at times and be an advocate for change. Some other points, like, be open and accept that this takes time and that it's complicated and there will be pushback, and you'll have to just continue to follow the lead of the community. Be flexible with your meeting times and with the people you're working with. Things will come up in people's lives, and you may have had a meeting scheduled and it doesn't happen, or it doesn't go the way you thought it was going to go. That's all part of the whole process. Melissa talked a bit about, rectifying power imbalances. So researchers are really used to holding all of the power. And we're very, very privileged, and so privileged, I don't think we even see our privilege at times. So it's not always easy to give up some of that power, but it's really important. So Melissa talked about For example, letting the community, or not letting, the community should hold the research dollars if it's appropriate. And the community definitely should own the data and the research that you're developing together. So that's been really important, is to try, through my work, try and rectify those power imbalances, recognizing elders as the PhDs of the community. So, you know, if you're writing a grant proposal, there's always the scientific common CV that you have to provide for all investigators, and you know that the type of experience that elders hold and the knowledge they hold doesn't fit into those boxes that are designed in the grant, the funding agencies and the common CV website. So it's finding ways to disrupt those systems. I like what Melissa said about, you know, getting support from like-minded people, partnering beyond just the community with lots of incredible colleagues in and around Edmonton and Alberta that can be really helpful to work in this way. And the last thing I would say about how to work this way within academic systems is just, if you're doing this type of work, I would consider yourself really lucky. It's definitely been one of the most influential parts of my life. Definitely has made me really happy, made me a better person, I believe, and my children as well. So every day I'm in the community, I just feel so grateful and so privileged to be doing this work together. So I try and remain grounded in that as well. That's it.
Thank you. So I think you've already done this beautifully, Richard, but I'll kind of attempt to tie some of my ideas together in wrapping up today. So I have a picture of a path on the screen here, along with some key concepts. So it's a little bit cheesy, but I put this slide together because I think of myself as always being on a journey toward enacting these concepts. Something that we know is that we need an extensive amount of time to do this work, and that time needs to be prioritized because we have accountability to the communities that we work with. One of the first questions I get asked when I enter into a research partnership is sometimes, how long are you going to be here for? And I want to just be able to say for as long as I'm welcome, because the reality is that forming and maintaining relationships takes time. Being physically present takes time. But if I'm going to form meaningful partnerships, I have to find a way to make that time and be patient and to let things unfold in the way they need to without rushing my research for the sake of externally imposed deadlines, for example. I also want to emphasize the importance of Indigenous-centered solutions to the topics that we're researching. So we have to think about things like access to elders, traditional knowledge, embracing Indigenous community-grounded approaches to healing. So working with Indigenous communities, I need to be aware of all these different factors, not be too stuck about my own ideas or ways that I think research needs to be done. So in this way, I'm coming from the perspective that partnerships are more meaningful when research is community defined, when traditional knowledge is centered, and when we can celebrate and affirm Indigenous ways of knowing through our research, and when we can shine a light on the resilience and strengths of Indigenous communities rather than contributing to a deficit-based narrative. Also having the respect and insight to recognize that there's huge diversity among Indigenous communities. So we can't tell you what's going to work for any given community just given that they're Indigenous. So we've been really intentional about communicating some general ideas and principles while keeping in mind that there's rich diversity there. And also the idea that colonial practices and policies are systemic, and we need to think about how that plays out in our research in ways that we might not even be aware of. And just lastly, I hope that we've stressed the importance of relationships today, how this might mean an expansion beyond the typical researcher role, that reflexivity is so critical to working effectively in partnership, and that includes humility, giving up some of the control that we might be accustomed to as researchers in order to be accountable to relationships. And also that we have a responsibility as researchers and clinicians to do our own work. So to understand the territory that we're on, understand Indigenous teachings, and as Richard just said, to grapple with our own power and privilege in honoring the Indigenous-centered solutions that need to be at the heart of our research when we're engaging in partnership. And so I think I will leave it there as well. And pass it back to you, Richard, if you want to say a few words to wrap up.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much more to add. I'll basically just be reiterating what you've already said. I don't have all this figured out, and that's okay. This is a highly cyclical process. It's not linear, it's complicated, it's not straightforward, it's highly rewarding. I can say without a doubt that building relationships is the best part of my job. So just to drive home a few things again, take the lead of the community is really important. Your intentions are really important. Is it for your benefit or for the community's? Humility, practicing humility, unlearning, be open to learning, take the necessary time to build those relationships. And although it's cliche, it really is all about relationships. It's definitely the blueprint, the foundation. And like Melissa said, as long as the community will have me, I'll be in partnership with them. That's it. I think I've definitely talked long enough, and we should open it up for questions, discussion, comments, etc.
Thank you, Melissa and Richard. Are there any questions?
And if
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions.
I was going to say people could type in the chat as well. They haven't.
Okay. Okay. So we had a comment from Karen. She would just like to say thank you for all the great information. Are there specific organizations or individuals that can be approached to help make those initial connections with individuals? That question is from Karen.
Well, there's the Alberta First Nations Information Governance Center, AFNIGC, that is Indigenous run, that is becoming like the stewards of OCAP in Alberta, I would say. And then there's the National First Nations Information Governance Center. So this organization works really closely with a lot of communities across the province, and they carry out their own research with communities, but also can help bridge those partnerships with communities, can help with developing research agreements, and help with straightening out things with communities such as data ownership and control and so forth. So that's one that you could definitely reach out to, is AFNIGC.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Danielle made the comment, Melissa and Richard, that was a fabulous, interesting, and informative talk. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And Paulette said, thank you so much. Very meaningful presentation. This is from Barbara. For remote communities, do you have any recommendations on how to build relationships when you can't be there often?
Well, I have worked with remote communities up in the north, including Little Red River, which I think is the most isolated and remote community in Alberta. And I had very little luck trying to do that over Zoom or over the phone. It definitely took going up to the community, and I went there a number of times, and I had amazing experiences. So maybe that's not the answer you wanted, but I think you definitely you have to start by going to the community and meeting people face to face. Once that relationship has developed, I found we were able to work in a virtual way over the phone or over Zoom, et cetera. But it definitely took going to the community at first to build that relationship. I don't know if you had anything to add, Melissa.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. And I think COVID has helped us learn some lessons in that regard when we can't be physically present, especially in those more remote and isolated communities where we don't want to be going in and spreading anything. So that has been my biggest learning is that in-person relationships and interactions can't actually take the place, or sorry, virtual or remote or phone or whatever it is, interactions can't take the place of in person. It's just not the same. I've been lucky to have formed these relationships and partnerships already. So like you said, Richard, once those are established, it's easier to kind of maintain those without a physical presence when you can't be there, like with COVID. But I think about, like I've spoken about the Early Years Project quite a bit with the Martin Family Initiative. So they're based in Montreal. But as part of this project, pre-COVID, their director of the program would be in Alberta in the community for at least 10 days out of every month. So she was living out of a suitcase a lot. I don't think I would be able to do that, but that was just in recognition of how important it is to be present in person. So I would just echo what you said, that we can't skip that step, at least initially, of getting to know people and being present, and perhaps that lends itself to maintaining those relationships after we can't physically be there as much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Christina has more of a comment. CIHR is changing how and who is considered an NPA. An NPA can be an Indigenous non-governmental organization in Canada with a research and or knowledge mobilization mandate. Let's see. Reynolds said, asks, any special considerations or suggestions when the focus is biological, environmental focused research rather than social science?
No, I would still stand by everything we said today about building relationships and all the key points that we discussed. I think it's not necessarily the topic. It's more about how you collaborate with the community. That's really important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I've just helped a group, actually, not from the U of A, but from elsewhere in Alberta, develop an Indigenous community engagement plan. And they're very biologically focused, their research. And I essentially reiterated a lot of the points that we've made today. The only special consideration is if there are biosamples being collected, then I think there's really special protocols and considerations that need to be taken into account, but that will completely depend on the community, their openness to it, what some of the protocols are around that. But I agree with you, Richard, that the same principles apply.
Yeah. For some of the projects we've done, we have collected biological samples or are planning to do so, and it just reinforces the need to develop those relationships in order to create those processes to collect biological samples in a community appropriate way.
Okay, thank you. And I see that someone has their hand raised. So can you please unmute yourself and you can ask your question?
Sure. Hi, this is Rhonda Bell, and thanks Richard and Melissa for your inspirational and terrific talks, both of you. This is a question that just kind of struck me as the two of you were talking. A lot of times when we talk about communities, there's actually a physical community of people present. So Maskwacis is a good example where people live in a community. And we know that I think upwards of 40 to 50% of Indigenous peoples live in urban settings and may not associate closely with their community, or may be, multi-generational now, living in an urban setting and may not connect to their home community. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about how we reach and work with people living outside of their home community, and maybe if that poses, slightly different methods or not issues necessarily, but considerations. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Maybe I'll go first and then you can add, Richard. I've actually been thinking about this a lot because I'm starting up, it's just getting off the ground, a research project in partnership with the Edmonton Police Service around how police institutions and police officers can improve the way that they work with young people who are experiencing different forms of marginalization, including Indigenous youth. And so then that begs the question, well, who is the community that we're reaching out to? And I almost always anchor my work in a partnership with some sort of agency. So we're going to be working with a couple of different inner city agencies that work with and serve youth who are justice involved. And so that doesn't mean that there's a discrete or neat community that I'm going to be working with. But I think it's important to have a grounding in some kind of a partner or partnership, because that can, I think that can help in facilitating rapport and trust building with people who maybe aren't any longer living in the communities that they come from. So that would be my approach or my experience so far. But I don't know if you had anything to add, Richard.
Yeah, a little bit I could add. It's difficult, but like, what does community mean can have so many different meanings. Generally, it's just people that have a collective sense of belonging. So a community can mean many, many, many different things. And figuring out how to do this within a large city like Edmonton, which is a melting pot for Indigenous peoples and other cultures, is definitely a challenge. And like Melissa said, I'm kind of just stepping into that for myself. So started a research project with some colleagues based out of the Royal Alex Hospital. And we have a master's student that's working on a project that is focused specifically on trying to understand how do we develop meaningful relationships and engagement in a large metropolitan city such as Edmonton. So we hope to learn more about that through the interviews that she's doing. But I was involved with a program called Pregnancy Pathways, which provides safe housing and wraparound support to pregnant homeless women living downtown Edmonton. And there was a big research component to that project as well. And there's many different agencies and organizations, like Melissa mentioned. It's about finding out who those key players are, I guess, within cities and partnering with them. So for that project, I know we had over 30 or 40 different partners. Métis Child and Family Services, Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society, Bissell Center, Mustard Seed, the Boyle Macaulay Health Center, Catholic Social Services, City of Edmonton, and on and on. So I guess it's about finding who those key players are and partnering with them. And we definitely had elder input, elders living within Edmonton. So I think like generally the same principles can be applied. It's just might be a bit more difficult to find out who the players are.
No, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate those answers.
And yeah, I see the question about the book that was, or if there's any recommendations for learning about decolonizing research. That's my #1 go-to book as well, is Research's Ceremony by Sean Wilson. Would be the best starting point.
Are there any other questions? Okay, we have about 7 minutes left until 1:30. Is there any other closing comments you would like to say or leave us with, Richard or Melissa?
Not for me. I am really hot and tired.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say thank you to everybody for sticking with us during this excessively hot day. I know I'm melting myself, and thank you for the questions as well. And thank you, Luana.
Okay. Thank you, Melissa and Richard.
Yeah.
You're welcome.